Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Wednesday at the Watering Hole. I'm Amy Nelson. I'm a senior writer at Biohabitats and the coordinator of this webinar series. Great to see so many of you joining us today. And I'd like to give a special welcome to all of the CITES accredited professionals who are joining us today. And for those of you who are not familiar with CITES, it's a sustainability rating system for projects and also a credential for professionals in land development. Today's webinar is Restoring Nature's Green Infrastructure, Streams, Wetlands, and Floodplains, and it's being presented by Joe Berg. Joe is a senior ecologist and practice leader at Biohabitats, and Joe has been protecting, restoring, regenerating aquatic ecosystems for over 35 years. So he has a lot of information to share with you today about these ecosystems, how to identify them, how to understand how they function, and how the protection and restoration of these aquatic ecosystems can really advance design and help you bring even more to the constituents and communities and clients for whom you do your work. Andy Rutherford, a landscape architect and CITES AP at Biohabitats, had planned to join us today, but she had an unexpected conflict, and she's not able to be with us. But fortunately, we have with us Aiman Duckworth. Aiman is a landscape architect and urban ecologist at Biohabitats. Aiman's expertise is in geospatial modeling and in the evaluation of ecosystem services, and he has done that work for planning and design projects at all scales. And he's actually used the CITES system in sustainability benchmarking in many different projects, including one on the grounds of the U.S. Capitol complex in D.C. Aiman will be handling your questions today. Although everyone is muted, you can ask a question at any time using the question box in your control panel. Aiman will be answering some of those questions during today's session, and then we'll have an open question and answer period at the end of Joe's talk. Today's webinar will be recorded, and in a couple of days you'll receive an email from me along with a link to the recording in case you want to revisit it or share it with people. Before I turn things over to Joe, I wanted to thank and welcome Danielle Pieranuzzi. Danielle is the CITES program manager for GBCI, and it's through Danielle's collaboration and the collaboration of the CITES and GBCI family that we were able to offer this webinar as a way to earn continuing education credits. And we're really appreciative of that collaboration. And I know Danielle would like to talk to you very briefly about the CITES program. Danielle?
Thank you, Amy, and thank you, Joe and Aiman, for doing this great presentation. I'm really excited to work with Biohabitats. They're one of our newest CITES community partners, and so CITES is a rating system for sustainable land design and development. Like Amy mentioned, it's similar to LEED for buildings, but CITES is really looking at everything outside of the building envelope or for project sites without buildings, and really trying to elevate the value of landscapes and the ecosystem services they provide. There are different ways to get involved through projects. We have over 200 projects worldwide in 15 countries participating in CITES and in 38 U.S. states. So it's really, you can get involved as a project on a project team or get the professional credential, which is the CITES AP that was mentioned, and the CITES CEU that we're offering here today. And other ways to get involved if your organization is interested is to become a CITES community partner. So we're really excited to work with Biohabitats, who really helped to develop these credits that are going to be discussed today. So I'm going to pass it back to Amy. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Danielle. And to all attendees, if you see in your control panel, there's a handout tab. And if you click on that arrow, there are a couple of CITES handouts in there that you can download at any time during the talk. So now we are ready for the webinar to begin, and I will turn it over to Joe. Thank you all so much again for joining us today. You probably won't hear from me until we're just about out of time. Thank you.
And of course, I realized as soon as you handed it over to me that I was looking at the last slide, not the first slide. Sorry about that. I want to say, good afternoon and thanks. Certainly appreciate the time that you're willing to spend going through this, and I hope you will find it's a good use of your time. I'll just start by getting into the rating system and what I'll be addressing in part today. Really, it's focused on site context, my presentation on assessment and planning, really heavily focused on water, soil, and vegetation, and then a little bit in terms of performance monitoring and innovation and performance. This is the normal sequence of processes you all know, the bar across the top of the screen, and then these elements across the bottom of the screen are really what I'm going to be focusing on today. And hopefully these are the presentation will help you all to conceptualize maybe some of these opportunities to protect floodplains, conserve aquatic resources, etc. That maybe you had a different image of these things in your mind before this presentation. I'd like to start off by talking a little bit about the integration of watersheds, because as society, as technicians of one sort or another, we're always separating things into what we do and what other people do, and really it's all gray. So if you'll look on the right hand side of the slide, you'll see these three cases, sites without aquatic systems, site with naturally occurring aquatic systems, and sites with degraded aquatic systems. And your projects can have significant influence on all of these. But that first case, I really want to point out that even if you have a site that's in an open field and there's no stream, there's no aquatic resource, there's no floodplain, there's no topographic feature there, you're still connected to an aquatic system because the watershed is integrated. And when it rains, that water is going to find its way downstream to an aquatic resource. And how you handle that rain when it lands on your site dictates whether you're going to be able to conserve and protect aquatic systems, or whether you're just contributing to the last 100 years of watershed and water resource degradation. When we talk about sites with these naturally occurring aquatic resources, I'm going to get into this in a little bit more detail, but I just want to point out that there is no place on the face of this earth where we all live that hasn't been disturbed by the anthropogenic disturbance that people have wrought. And like I said, I'll get into that in significantly more detail, but just recognize that there's no such thing as an aquatic system or even a terrestrial system that hasn't been disturbed by humankind. So when we think about restoration, there's two ways to think about it. One of them is the right amount of medicine to fix the problem, and that's a pretty mature view. That's an approach that requires a little bit more reflection. And unfortunately, the more common scenario is the hand of the designer, where the person who's in charge of the project has, an epiphany, and they are going to implement their epiphany. And the reality is that we're working in systems that have their own resilience and their own self-organization. So when a designer forces something into the environment and the success of their design is based on their vision, they're setting themselves up for failure. And we could talk about that a little bit more as we go on. When I think about the causes of resource degradation, it's usually urbanization of watersheds, because what we do at the top of our watershed has adverse impacts at the bottom of our watershed where our aquatic resources occur. And I reflected a little bit on that idea of a self-organizing system versus building a restored system. And when we try to sort of hold that restoration approach too close to our ego or too close to our engineering standards, we fail, because the system is going to be changing over time due to too many variables for us to really be able to conceptualize. So I want to share this perspective with all of you, and it's not, unfortunately, it's not a commonly held understanding. But let's take a few steps back. About 300 years ago, there were 600 million beaver all across North America. And those beaver controlled every single stream and river and wetland with their activities. So they're a keystone species. They built dams. They backwatered adjacent areas. They created loads of wetlands. They increased landscape diversity by taking out trees and increasing other forms of vegetation. So we just cannot underestimate the effect that the beaver have had on our watersheds. Now, you know, when the Europeans showed up, in a matter of only 40 to 60 years, we converted beaver to money, basically. And you can imagine if there was a money tree in a public park in your community, there'd be no leaves on it because people would be out there pulling all that off. Well, that's what happened with the beaver. The beaver pelts were traded as a form of currency, and in only 40 to 60 years, they were extirpated, functionally extirpated from the landscape. And with the loss of that kind of 600 million beaver, what happened was all of their dams settled and failed. Water being delivered to those ponds that were behind those dams broke through the dams, down cut through all this rich organic deposit that had formed over millions and millions of years. The humans have only been on the North American landscape maybe for 10,000 years. Beaver have been here for many millions of years, managing our stream valleys and our streams. So a lot of people don't really think about the resource with that context. Now, as the European population grew, we started imitating beaver by putting in a lot of mill ponds. That helped us. That we used water power as a concentrated source of energy to grind our grain, to saw our wood for furniture, to make our cloth for clothes, and that was a pretty short period of time, and we were nowhere as effective in terms of the density of these mill ponds as the beaver were. But we still had a lot of mill ponds on a lot of streams all across North America. And with the advent of coal and oil development and use as a concentrated fuel, water power as a concentrated fuel was abandoned because water power was pretty hard to manage. You know, you'd have a big storm, your dam would fail, you'd have to fix it. You'd have all the land clearing going on upstream of your pond. The pond would fill with sediment. You'd have to move the dam further downstream. So mill dams were a bit of a maintenance nightmare. So when we started using oil and coal, the mill dams were abandoned. And about the same time, about half of our agricultural landscape was abandoned because now there were these chemical fertilizers that could do a lot more production of crops. And, you know, subsistence farmers were like, the heck with this, I'm gonna go work in Detroit and make automobiles or whatever their industrial opportunity. That was the advent of the Industrial Revolution. And literally half of the farming landscape in North America was abandoned and slowly ceded back to a forested environment. Now, there had been a lot of damage to the streams because when those mill ponds were abandoned and all the sediment that was trapped behind those mill dams became liberated as the dams failed, and that was all washed downstream, we ended up coming up with this U-shaped channel, which is a conveyance channel. It has little value for the natural resources because it optimizes how much water can flow through a minimum part of the environment. And really, the best functional value we get with restoration is by increasing the surface area of the environment that the water comes in contact with. So there's a lot more to say about this, but I'll just move on. And this slide is just reinforcing that the fact that aquatic resources are integrated in the watershed. Doesn't matter what site you're developing, redeveloping, building on, whether it's greenfield or brownfield, any water that lands on that site is going to find its way off site into an aquatic resource. So if you design with that reality in mind, you're going to be way ahead of the folks that have preceded you. I've already talked quite a bit about how we've changed the watershed hydrology and whether this site was actually built in the 100-year floodplain or whether there was a 100-year floodplain filled downstream of this site. The effect is the same. There's improper management of the floodplain resource, which has resulted in a lot of harm. So just to run through some of these things, as we shed water off of the landscape, you've got a lot more energy being delivered. That energy, that water, can carry a lot more material, sediments and nutrients. Those flows in the stream channel cause the stream channel to enlarge, which actually adversely impacts the groundwater in that area. In a city like Annapolis, Maryland, there's a documented 17 foot of groundwater loss, 17 foot of vertical loss of groundwater because of groundwater well use as well as incised stream channels and agricultural drainage features. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this graphic because it's really fundamental to how we can conserve our aquatic resources. So this is called a hydrograph. And on the vertical axis, discharge, that's really talking about a lot of water, cubic feet per second or liters per second of water that is being discharged, coming down the stream over time, which is the horizontal axis at the bottom of the graph. And now let's just talk about a scenario where we have a rain, we have a big rain, and on the curve that's labeled A, what happens is as that rain is falling, so that's the undeveloped watershed curve. As the water is falling, it's hitting the trees, it's sticking to the trees, it's wetting the tree leaves, and then it's once the surface of the trees are saturated with the water will drip into the understory. And there's a duff. All the old leaf litter that's underneath of those trees are like a sponge that sucks up a lot of water and soaks that water up. If the rain continues to come down so that the tree surface is saturated, the duff is saturated, then you start having water moving through the duff into the underlying soil, infiltration. So the bottom line of this, it takes a lot of rain in a pre-development good forest condition before you have any runoff. And that graph is showing a significant delay in time before you reach that peak, and then a really long period of time for the watershed to de-water after the rain event stops. Now you can contrast that with curve B, and unfortunately curve B is the dominant curve in North America because it's only in the 1970s and 80s when we started requiring quantity control and quality control for our stormwater runoff, which is curve C. But basically, all of our cities, all of our suburban areas around the cities that were built prior to, say, 1980, they were designed to just shed the water as quickly as they could, put it into an inlet structure, put it into a pipe, get the pipe off to the unprotected environment where nobody is living so that it's not causing driveway flooding water going into the cellar, etc. And the result of that is you have this really steep increase in the peak discharge, which is as the precipitation continues and more rain is coming down, more and more water is being delivered through that really simple drainage system. So the water can come out of some of those pipes at 30 feet per second, which is about 20 miles an hour. And that does a lot of work in the stream channel. That enlarges the channel, that causes the channel to sink lower into the environment, because not only are you eroding the banks of the stream, but you're eroding the bed of the stream and transporting that sediment downstream. And that's lowering the adjacent groundwater table. Now, we've come up with this approach for stormwater management ponds where we let the water come in as quickly as it rains, but we restrict the outlet. And so the pond actually fills up with water and then is draining at a lower rate than what it is being delivered to the pond. So that gives you this, you see this elevated water level, and for a much longer period of time. And there's this other concept, and I'm going back to physics now, which is called work, which is force defined as force times distance, or velocity times time. So the longer the duration of water you have, the more work that is being done in the environment. The higher your peak discharge is, the more work that is being done in the environment. So B and C are almost equivalent in terms of they're shedding the same amount of water. The C is a little less energetic, but it's applying a little less energy over a longer period of time. So it's about the same amount of work. So I'm just putting that in because we're going to bring this up again and again in our discussion today. These three images, the image on the left is the situation. There's no stormwater, there's no pipe. This is just more water being discharged to an unprotected natural area, and it's head cutting. And that's a 6 foot tall guy there, and that's an 8 or 9 foot deeply incised channel. And you can imagine what that's doing to the adjacent groundwater. If you had a house that was backing up on this, it wouldn't be a very desirable situation. The center image is one of our coworkers, Kevin, standing in a stream, and he is a solid 6 foot, 6'1", and you can see how high the bank is. And just imagine all that soil eroding every time you have a gully washer. And then on the far right, that's a stormwater outfall from a pond, from a stormwater management pond, and it's remarkably the same as that first panel. So it doesn't matter whether you have a stormwater management pond or not, you're going to cause degradation in the receiving stream. So that's why I was saying earlier on, up in the watershed where you're working, even if there's no mapped aquatic resources, how you handle that water has a really significant effect on the downstream aquatic resources. And I also talked about how most of our sites, most of our urban sites were developed without stormwater management. Well, it's actually a little worse than that. If you look at the darkest areas on this image of Baltimore, it's showing you that 80 to 100% of our streams were filled or piped. So that's a lack of aquatic resource. Now, you'll hear, or you already have heard, a lot about conveyance, that stream channels should be designed to convey water and sediment. And that's old thinking, and it's really not the way historically our streams were. Our streams historically were processing systems, not conveyance systems. If water was delivered to the system, it was put out onto the floodplain. Any sediment or any nutrients that were in it were a resource that the plants capitalized on. And so now what we've done is, first off, we've converted almost all of our streams to conveyance system, because there's very little natural environment doing very little work on our waters, just getting it through the system to downstream where it can do more harm. And what we really should be thinking about is how can we handle that water more like a resource? Because if you think about it, precipitation is distilled water. It's water that has evaporated from the landscape, gone up into the clouds, condensed, and then fallen again. So it's super clean water before it drips through our polluted atmosphere and runs over our contaminated ground surfaces. This is an image of what's called a bank full flow. So this is a small stream channel, and this is a pretty large rain event, probably 3.5 inches of precipitation, made this channel run full of water. And this is how a lot of folks are managing their streams, by creating this kind of a bank full discharge. And after that storm passes, this is what's left in the stream. You can see raw banks. You can see there's hardly any water in the bottom. And if you think about a fish like a sunfish or a perch, those fish are compressed, and they might be 3 to 5 inches tall from belly to back. And there's not even that much water in the stream. There's 1 inch of water in the bottom of this stream. So obviously this stream can't support those kind of fish. It can probably support some mud minnows and some other fish, but there's not enough habitat in this stream to support aquatic life. And the water quality is not that good. And because this has the water is so low, because the channel has been over enlarged by the energetic discharges that we continue to put into it, we've lowered the groundwater table. And for those of you that are focused on non-native invasive species, what lowering the groundwater table does is it allows soil microbes to much more quickly convert unavailable organic nutrients into readily available inorganic nutrients. That's called remineralization. And native plants have evolved on the landscape to be able to use very low levels of nutrients. But if you were to fertilize them, they wouldn't really be able to efficiently convert that extra fertilizer into extra seed or extra biomass. A lot of our non-native and opportunistic species are able to do that. So when you fertilize multiflora rose or Japanese knotweed or any of these other honeysuckle, any of these other pain plants that we have, they can produce more seed, they can produce more biomass, more root, and so they can take over and basically displace our native species. Not really what we want to be supporting. And that can happen even when you have this development that is up well above the influence, apparent influence of an aquatic resource, because everything you shed is causing this kind of channel enlargement in the aquatic resource downstream. I wanted to talk a little bit about wetlands, and I've already made the point that there's this integration of aquatic resources in the watershed. And I want to double down on that, because not only are aquatic resources integrated into the watershed, but wetlands are integrated into the floodplain. Streams are integrated into the wetland. So this is not that's a stream and this is a wetland and that's a floodplain. They're usually, and they should be, a mosaic of these features together. And that's where we have the greatest edge, the greatest habitat, the greatest function. So always, to the extent that I'm beating the horse, I'm sorry about that, but it really is a critical failure on society, especially technical society, that we are so fast to separate out the different elements when really they're all connected. I wanted to review the wetland classification by Cowardin. This is the standard Fish and Wildlife Service classification, and if you've ever looked at the National Wetland Mapping, so the National Wetland Inventory, this is the classification system that's used in that inventory, and that's available for any place on the landscape, but it's generally an underestimate of actual wetland distribution, because it was done from air photo interpretation and typically relied on either surface waters being evident on the aerial photographs or some plant community that was, obviously a wetland plant community. And there are a lot of forested wetlands that don't look like a wetland community. So let's start with the marine. That's full strength seawater. And there's very few plants that are well adapted to full strength seawater. But those plants grow like gangbusters. It's some of the most productive natural environments in the world, productive in terms of biomass and carbon. Estuarine environments are this mix of fresh and marine. So the Chesapeake Bay, Delaware Bay, San Francisco Bay, etc., and some large river discharges into the ocean create this estuarine environment where you have brackish water, 1.5 to 3 parts per thousand, up to full strength salt water, which is like 34 to 38 parts per thousand salt. Again, there's a gradient from low plant diversity in the high strength marine environment where you have 34 parts per thousand to a much more diverse system where you have that lower salt and things like wild rice where it's fresh. Riverine, which is between the banks of a river. A lot of folks will say, well, it's a floodplain of a river. Well, that's not a riverine wetland. That would be a palustrine wetland. And then you have lacustrine, which is associated with lakes. So if you've just got a forested wetland outside of the banks of a stream or a river, that's typically a palustrine. And that's a very common wetland type in most of the projects that we'll come across. In addition, the Cowardin Classification gets into some of these kind of form-based classifications, low marsh versus high marsh, or forested, shrub, persistent emergent, non-persistent emergent, open water, mud, floating leaved. So that's, these are some of the more extreme cases of wetlands where you see, floating leaved aquatics. That's tends to be a lot of times lacustrine. Just carrying that on, because Cowardin talked about wetlands as well as streams, is you have perennial streams, which I think we all are familiar with. That's the stream that supports the most fish. It has flowing water typically every day of every year. Maybe during an extreme drought, you might have parts of a perennial stream that lose water flow. There's some real challenges in karst topography where maybe you have a perennial stream, but it goes subsurface for a certain length and then it pops back up to the surface. Intermittent streams are streams that typically have flowing water in the winter, in the spring, but in the heat of the summer and in the early fall, they're dry. Sometimes that's a function of their watershed, like a small watershed. Sometimes that's a function of their geology, like in the case of a karst system. And then ephemeral streams usually only have a flow when it rains or when you have snow melt. And that drainage persists for a really short period of time. And typically, like I said, just hours to days or weeks after a rain or a snow melt. There's another way of looking at a stream classification based on their size. So you've got the perennial stream, and that's typically going to be a larger order stream, and the ephemeral stream is typically going to be a lower order. So a first order stream is the start of the stream system. That's the swale that is coming down the side slope. It has a washed bottom, so you see the stones or vegetation. A second order stream is at the confluence of two first order streams, and the second order stream might have 30 or 40 or 50 first order streams that come to it. And a third order stream is at the confluence of two second order streams. So this isn't a linear building. So it's not like two first order streams make a second order stream and then the next confluence of that second order stream makes a third. You might have 500 miles of first order stream in a watershed, 7 miles of second order stream, and 1 mile of third order stream in a watershed. So it's more of a geometric or an exponential kind of relationship between first order and third order. Something like 85% of all the stream miles in North America are first and second order streams. Some stream valley features, and these are common, and this is a restored system with a beaver pond in the middle, and if you look on the right hand side, that would be a stream channel, and that's a U-shaped channel that is optimized for conveyance of water due to erosion. This is draining the city of Annapolis, so you've got a square mile of impervious surface up around 65% impervious. So a high energy, lots of erosion, and that water is getting through there. That as a stream migrates back and forth across the floodplain when it has a surplus of sediment, you can see these oxbows and old meanders, which tend to represent some of the wetlands that we see in the riparian zone. The riparian zone is that area that is adjacent to the stream channel. It could be steeply sloped and be fairly narrow, or it could be, like in this case, very broad and very wet, so that riparian area could be dry and small, or it could be a beautiful wetland with vernal pools if it's broad. It could also be a floodplain. So when we think about this, if you go from one valley slope to the other valley slope, that's sort of the riparian area. And in some cases, it might only be 10 foot wide. In other cases, it might be miles wide. In like the Oconee River in Georgia, I worked in an area where the floodplain was 6 miles wide in places. A lot of times where the steep valley slope comes down to the floodplain, you'll have wetlands at that interface because you have groundwater discharge coming out of that steep side slope on the valley, and it lays in a slough, which is a depressional feature far away from the stream, but right at the toe of slope of the valley. So very complicated, very complex, and this complexity is what drives diversity and productivity and a lot of the other things that we value in our aquatic resources. I had made the point that precipitation is distilled water. Then as it comes through our atmosphere, it picks up some nitrogen and some sulfur and whatever other soot, whatever other kind of stuff we've pumped up into the atmosphere. But it really doesn't start to have problems until it hits the ground and starts running off, because that's where water is much denser than air. So when water starts flowing along the ground, it has a lot of density, and it can pick up and entrain sediment and other pollutants and carry it along. So part of the solution is to interrupt that process. Like the water falls on the ground, capture it and get it into the soil as quickly as you can in as many locations as you can. It's sort of this distributed system. And that can be the idea of rain barrels, which you run soaker hoses into landscaping beds, size to handle the water coming off of the roof. I think with sites, there's a lot of opportunity to use your site development footprint as a basis for your requirement to manage stormwater runoff. The big problem that we have and have had since we first started putting sticks together is everything we do reduces the amount of water that can soak into the ground. So it increases the amount of water that runs off and causes this degradation. So if we were to be able to develop a 1 acre site, like let's just say a park that has a 50% impervious area, you'd have to find a way to put a 1/2 acre of infiltration in. So if you have 1 inch of precipitation on a 1/2 acre land, that's a big chunk of water. But if you can get it into the ground, you're really doing a lot. And so sometimes that's not possible because of the cost of upland development. So that's where we really get into this green infrastructure and opportunities to handle the water along the flow path, pushing it out into wetland areas, creating wetlands that are really attractive for plant composition, for bringing wildlife in, so it can really add a lot of value to your development. When we talk about getting help, you know, you could just run out and hire somebody and hope that they're well qualified, and you know, Biohabitats would love to have that role in your projects, but to really push the envelope, you all need to adopt this for yourself. You need to not just be narrow in your field. You need to try to integrate with the other professionals you're working with. So rather than hand off a project to your site civil engineer, tell them what you want and collaborate with them, and they'll learn. They'll have a better idea of your site goals, and you'll have a better idea of their challenges, and maybe together you can come up with innovative solutions. And the best projects that I've ever been involved with have been in projects where I've collaborated with other people that have different experience bases than me. I've learned the most that way, and I've had the best projects hit the ground. Also, the idea of being a member of these societies and having these professional certifications like Sites AP, a lot of value. Not just signing the check once a year, but participating at the chapter level, really engaging. I mean, that's the best part of my career. So I know you're probably sick of this. I've spent talking about it. I'm giving you this as a reminder. Here's a concrete tidal channel, and if you imagine at the top of the slide, you see there's a curve in that trapezoidal channel, and obviously what's happened is the water has come down this system so fast, like a flume at a water park. It's jumped outside of the trapezoidal channel, and it's caused all that erosion. And you see the size of that guy walking up that eroded hill slope, and you can see that how tall that bluff is. That's probably a 12 to 15 foot tall bluff that all that soil has worked its way downstream. Not really a good design, and an old design engineer would have eliminated some of these problems because they would have made it straight. They wouldn't have put curve in it. They would have made it, and they would have probably a deeper and narrower system. So it would have even less value for the resource, but it wouldn't have eroded this way because it would have just discharged it all down to the bottom, where even worse things could have happened because of how fast that water is moving and being delivered to the unprotected environment downstream. Here's the fix of that. Now, this is a lot better. Obviously, it's a lot rougher, it's a lot smaller, and the water has to work its way through here. So the water's moving through slower. Now, what would make this better is if there were some large pools on either side of this system, so that as the water is coming down, it can go out and soak into the ground. A much better planting plan, rather than just having this fescue that could have trees and shrubs, could really be a very attractive project. So this isn't really restoration, but this is engineering, and it is an improvement. And this is how that second approach is an improvement over the first. Imagine, and this is from a different project, but it's helping me to make the point. Here's a series of hydrographs, each hydrograph based on a precipitation event. So that first panel is from about a half-inch precipitation event. And what you see is the red hydrograph is from the urban runoff, and the black hydrograph for the same storm shows more of that curve C that we talked about before. The curve A rather, whereas the red one is the curve B. And you see that over a series of different precipitation events. You know, so that change from that flume, which was a very simple way to convey water from upstream to downstream and allow the water to develop incredible velocity and had a really long flow path, results in those really peaky discharges that do so much damage. And where you have all this roughness in the system, it forces the water to flow more slowly. You have some losses of water along the flow path because it has the time to start soaking into the soil. So a much better approach, but still not quite restoration. This is a project, Carriage Hills, and I'm going to start trying to run through this a little quicker. It's a common problem. This is 22 foot in size, just downstream from a stormwater outfall. What we did was we backfilled that incised gully with this coarse mix of sand and wood chips, and I'll touch base on that a little bit. But think of that as a biological filter. And then on top of that, we built a stream. And then we filled that stormwater outfall, that stormwater drainage network, with cobble. So on small storms, the water can still go in and soak into this channel fill that we placed. But at high flows, the water can't flow through that cobble fill in the pipes as fast as it needs to. So we knocked the top off of that stormwater pipe, and the water now flows out over top in this constructed stream channel. And of course, the bottom of the stream channel is not lined with any kind of impervious fabric. So as the water fills each of the pools, it's so soaking into the underlying carbon-rich channel fill. This is what that stream looked like during Superstorm Sandy. And for the folks that was a really big storm. That's about 7 inches of rain over a 24-hour period. So not quite a 100-year storm, but pretty close. And which would you rather have beside your home? This kind of a risk to your kids, they'll fall in there and break their neck, or something like this that is attracting birds, other wildlife, and very little risk of harm. So here's some of the analysis from the monitoring for that project. And the vertical axis on the left side is just the number of runoff events. So when it rains, the water gets into the pipes and is discharged to the stream, and you have a runoff event. The horizontal axis is looking at a sort of a categorization of the precipitation events. So like the first red bar is storms from 0.05 or a 20th of an inch to a quarter of an inch. And then the second one is a quarter to a half inch, a half to 3/4 of an inch. And you see a really significant difference with the red bars and the blue bars. The red is the unrestored paired watershed study, and the blue is the restored stream result. So in the first half inch of precipitation, which is a very common storm event, you've got 23 runoff events, 24 runoff events working in the stream, enlarging the stream channel. And in the restored reach, you only have 3 events because most of the water is traveling through that carbon-rich sand fill, being purified, receiving that biological treatment. Now, as you start to get over to the 1 inch and 2 inches and greater storms, there's really no difference in terms of the number of runoff events, because you can only provide so much treatment in a small area, in a channel. The larger the channel restoration project, the more we could move to have more treatment further into larger storm events. But for this particular restoration project, we didn't see any difference on storms that were an inch or larger. The other important statistic here is that 95% of the annual precipitation events in this region of the country, and I'm talking about eastern US, are 1 inch or less. So 95% of the storms have 1 inch or less of rain associated with them. So basically, we're treating 95% of the storms, and we're reducing the number of runoff events by 2/3, 36 events up to that 1 inch versus 11 events from the restored reach. But even when you get into those larger events, so the short horizontal black bars relate to the the numerical values on the right-hand side of the graph, the rainfall depth, and then the peak discharge. So that's how high that hydrograph gets. And that B graphic that I talked about before is the light gray bars. That's the unrestored paired watershed. So what you see is big peaks, and the dark gray bars are the restored streams. So you have half of the peak discharge, which means you're not getting the velocity, you're not getting the volume of water moving down the stream. So even on large events like a 100-year storm, you're still having a really significant positive effect. I'm going to quick. I talked a moment ago about this carbon-rich sand bed placed in an incised channel as a biological filter, and that's called hyporheic processing, and that's really significant for mineral removal, for metals, for denitrification, getting rid of surplus nitrogen, for complexing phosphorus. So it's a really important function. And what we do is we place that on the landscape, we put stormwater on the upslope side of it and force the stage of that seepage reservoir to move its way through that seepage bed, which attenuates the energy and also improves the water quality. This is about a 40-acre surface mine out by Ocean City, Maryland. This was our design approach, where we're borrowing a little water out of a stream, which is this location. I hope you can see my and we're all of these areas where you see this dashed line, they're the hyporheic beds. So we have this seepage reservoir going all the way around the site, and this is a 30-acre wetland restoration site. And this is what it looked. Dot that you see there is an Atlantic white cedar. There's about 8,000 Atlantic white cedars planted. This is what it looks like from the ground after the first full growing season. And the Atlantic white cedar puts a lot of carbon into the ground, which is sort of building on that seepage process and purifying water. Now, this has been monitored for 6 or 7 years since it was. Yeah, let's just, I think it's probably good to, this is the, probably where I'll stop. So we do have some time for questions.
Joe, this is Aiman.
Hey, Aiman, how are you doing?
Hi, good. We've got a good bit of questions that have come in. So let me try to select some that might be the most relevant to the largest group with the time that we have. So one good question here. What is the best way to determine when an aquatic resource has been restored? Are there metrics or factors to monitor? Another way to ask might be, are there ways to monitor the performance of an aquatic resource to determine if the restoration was successful?
Absolutely, and I guess the first response is you have to define the goals of your restoration project to be able to develop a monitoring approach and be able to document whether or not you've been successful. If you're doing a forest restoration, it could be as simple as, I'm going to plant 400 trees and I want 90% of the trees to survive and grow. And you know, that's maybe an oversimple example, but you absolutely can document success of the monitoring, of success of the restoration, but it's based on your performance standards and your goals. And sometimes they can be overly simplistic because people don't want to fail. And you know, the more complicated and the larger the resource, the more challenging the monitoring effort is. that's a really big question for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Well, maybe just to follow up briefly then. So for this monitoring, this restoration monitoring follow-up, is that something that a site manager or a landscape manager could be trained to monitor? Or would that require some special expertise, equipment, or some special consultant to do that properly?
Yeah, it's going to depend on the complexity of the project and the stated goals for that restoration project. So obviously, you know, looking to see if the forest reforestation has been successful is something that doesn't require specialized expertise. It requires some common sense and the ability to see and count trees. Alternatively, something where you're looking at a 40% nitrogen reduction from you know, 1,000-acre wetland system, obviously is going to require much more specialized expertise and tools and knowledge.
And then maybe time to squeeze in one last one. So, you know, some of the site's work involves a good bit of pre-design and understanding the quality of the resources that are there. So could you comment briefly on what you feel are the best methods and criteria to determine the existing quality of an aquatic resource?
Yeah, there are techniques like the Index of Biotic Integrity, which looks at fish and aquatic invertebrates and their biomass and diversity, the different number of species, et cetera. It integrates all those into values. But you know, it goes back to your goal setting. If you're interested in having a channel that doesn't just convey water and cause erosion, you could be looking at monitoring outputs like what was the peak discharge prior to restoration and what's the peak discharge for a given storm after restoration. And some of those are really fundamental and foundation type of monitoring efforts, but they require typically instruments installed, data loggers prior to any kind of modification, and then continue to monitor them after the construction is complete. There's, you know, working with other folks and collaborating with other professionals is really, I think, the target. That's the goal that we should all have to be able to deliver the best projects. I know that can sound like a financial challenge on some projects, but it's really what I think we're all about.